Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective.
We pray you find this resource edifying, faithful to Scripture, and Christ exalting. Now, let's get started.
Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. Jimmy Johnson here with my co-host, Austin McCormick, and we have the privilege of having Dr. Michael Haykin on with us again. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Haykin.
Great to be with you.
And this episode, we're going to be talking about a particular Baptist by the name of Samuel Pearce. So to start us off, Dr. Haykin, can you give us a biographical sketch of Samuel Pearce?
Yes, Pearce was born in 1766, and he died very young in 1799. He died of tuberculosis, which was a big killer in the 18th century, along with smallpox. Baptist by root, by origins, he grew up in a Baptist home. His father and his grandfather were both members of the particular Baptist church in Plymouth, a church that went back to the 17th century. Its earliest pastor, Abraham Cheer, was called to the church probably in the middle of the English Civil War in the 1640s. And he would die in prison for his faith in the 1660s. And so he was had a very rich history. It had gone through some difficult times in the early 18th century, but by the time that Pearce was growing up in the church, it was very solid, stable work. Pearce was, though, influenced by companions in his early teens who led him astray. Naval towns like Plymouth was a major naval town, are not easy places for young people to grow up. There's all kinds of temptations, and Pearce fell into a number of them. But in the providence of God, at the age of 16, he was converted through the preaching of a visiting student pastor, a man named Isaiah Burt, who would eventually become the pastor of the church in Plymouth. And baptized the year following. By the mid-1780s, it was evident to the congregation that Pearce had gifts for ministry, and they suggested to him that he attend Bristol Baptist Academy, which was the only school in Britain for training Baptist ministers or Baptist pastors. A small school based in Bristol. Its roots also go back to the 17th century, but it had really only begun to function as a school in the 1720s. And when Pearce went there, the principal was a man named Caleb Evans, who had been a tutor under his father's principalship, and then he had inherited the principalship in the 1770s. And it was a fabulous experience for Pearce in many ways. He, in addition to obviously his theological studies, which also were combined with some what we would describe today as a liberal arts education, he had regular opportunities of preaching, and that's where it began to be evident that God had really gifted him with a remarkable ability to preach the gospel and to preach the scriptures. He became known as the silver-tongued. Kind of a similar epithet that you have with John Chrysostom meaning golden mouth. And it was also here he built friendships with men like William Stedman, who would be a major force for revival in the north of England, and also had the tremendous privilege of being mentored by Caleb Evans. Evans took a deep interest in all of the students. There were not many. There would only have been about 20 to 25. And he sought to secure them places of ministry after their graduation. And he played that role in Pearce's life, and Pearce was able to go to Cannon Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And he went there in 1789, formally ordained a year later, and that would be the only pastoral charge he had. It was a tumultuous era. It's the beginning of the French Revolution, when Pearce begins his ministry there. Birmingham was in the midst also of the Industrial Revolution, So many of the people in Pearce's congregation, there were about a couple hundred when he went there. By the end of his ministry, there would have been well upwards of 1,500, about 400 conversions during his ministry. 330 conversions led to people becoming members of the church. It's about 10 to 15 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it was tremendous growth for the church. Many of those who were converted were illiterate and employed in some of the really ugly factories that began to be built in the heart of Birmingham. I grew up in Birmingham, and remember a lot of the areas of Birmingham being slums that went back to the 19th century and that had their roots back into the days of Pearce when the Industrial Revolution began there. And so Pearce's ministry was very much to the poor, the downtrodden, and God gave him a fabulous companion in his wife Sarah. She was the daughter of a Baptist minister, a granddaughter of a Baptist minister by the name of John Ash. Her father had been a Baptist deacon, and they would have 5 children, 3 of whom would survive infancy, 1 of whom would marry a son of William Carey and would go to India. And their grandson, Samuel Pearce's great-grandson, and William Carey's great-grandson, Samuel Pearce Carey, was the author of the only biography of Pearce that was published as a book in the 20th century. There's been a few others since then in the 21st century, but Pearce was very well known during the 19th century. Andrew Fuller, his very close friend, wrote his memoirs. He was the sort of man, William Jay, another Baptist minister, said on one occasion, whose company makes you afraid to sin. And Jay and others who met Pearce and got to know him never forgot him. Years later, Jay had fond recollections of him 50 years after his death. And he made a deep, deep impression upon people. When Fuller wrote his memoirs, he emphasized, of course, our brother was not perfect in his life, but the main areas of sin that, and if I'm not even sure you want to call them sin or failing, that he could bring up were Pearce's insistence on staying up late at night studying and reading the scriptures and writing whatever, and the fact that he failed to take care of his body when he fell ill. He kept thinking he could keep preaching, and the cold that he had went into bronchitis and then into TB and eventually killed him. He was a man who packed into 10 very short years of his pastoral ministry and 40, 50 years of a Christian life, and was a remarkable Christian.
Well, thank you for that biographical sketch. And within the biographical sketch, you mentioned a number of people that he had an impact on. We have previously talked with you about friendship, so we're interested to know perhaps who had an impact on him. Who were some of Samuel Pearce's dearest friends throughout his life, and what commendable words did they have to say about him?
Yeah, William Carey would be one. There still exists a copy of the Greek New Testament that Pearce sent to Carey. When Carey had gone to India, he mailed this to Carey, and somehow it eventually found its way back to England. It's now in the Angus Library. And at the beginning of the book, the kind of a blank page before the title page, he has written Mia Cardia Kai Mia Psuke, one heart and one soul. And probably Carey's closest friend in the 1790s was Pearce. If you read Pearce's correspondence to him, it's certainly the most the warmest, and it's quite evident that these two men shared a deep bonds of friendship. Andrew Fuller would be another. Fuller preaches his funeral sermon. Fuller did tell him before his death that he was planning to Fuller wrote his memoirs. Fuller did tell him before Pearce's death that he was planning to write the memoirs, and he said, "Don't be afraid. I'm not going to puff you up as a celebrity." But in many ways, he did. I mean, you just couldn't. Otherwise, it was very difficult to find areas where people found fault with Pearce. When Fuller heard of his friend's death, he was on a street in Glasgow. He had gone north to raise funds for the Missionary Society that sent William Carey to India, which he and Pearce had done for many years. And Pearce obviously had fallen ill, and somebody who knew Fuller's friendship and had learned of Pearce's death told Fuller, and Fuller just was overcome with weeping and had to step out of the street into a side alley, lest people, wonder why he was not able to control his emotions. John Ryland Jr., because Fuller was in Scotland, Ryland Jr., the younger Ryland, took his funeral sermon, and he too talks about, in the printed version, how he was having difficulty at the beginning of the sermon controlling his emotions and being able to speak about his brother. And so Pearce was he was a man who was able to cultivate these sort of deep friendships. And in fact, in some ways, he was kind of a linchpin of all of these men. Their friendships would continue, obviously, after Pearce, but they never forgot the impact that Pearce had made upon their lives.
In both the biographical sketch as well as when I took the class with you on Andrew Fuller, we spent some time on Samuel Pearce, both reading the memoir that Andrew Fuller wrote of him, and also some letters of correspondence between Samuel Pearce and his wife. And you had mentioned her in the biographical sketch. So what do we know of Samuel's marriage with his wife Sarah, and what are some things that we should learn from him and glean from him as husbands, as it pertains to our wives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a fabulous kind of window into their marriage, because Pearce wrote at least 75 letters over the course of his life to his wife. These were usually written when he was away from her, raising money for the Missionary Society or on preaching excursions. For instance, in the mid-1790s, he went for 6 weeks to Dublin, and he kept a bit of a diary, but he also sent back these letters to his wife. So they give us a tremendous window on his perspective on their marriage. Regretfully, we don't have any of her letters to him, and I'm not sure why that is. She does mention after his death that and she's corresponding with a man named Joseph Belcher, who was in America, who had grown up in Birmingham. He'd grown up in the Sunday school in Pearce's church. And she mentions that she was not a great correspondent. So it could be the case that she didn't write letters avidly as he did. But it's very evident that their relationship was deep and warm. And Pearce was not afraid of telling her regularly how much he loved her. At one point he says, I'm out in company all the time and have the opportunity to meet numbers of women in these churches, but he said none can compare to my Sarah. And he was, the sort of we have letters he wrote before his engagement, before his marriage, when they were engaged, and you think, well, okay, those are the sort of letters that young couples always, if they do write letters to each other or notes to each other or say things to each other that he would say, and then as they get married, these things start to cool. But in fact, you find the opposite. You find him growing in his admiration for his wife and what she meant to him and how much he missed her. One of the critical things I think that I've always been impressed with in terms of those letters is the esteem that he has for his wife, the way he honors her. Many years ago, I had a student who has continued to be a friend, and he was heading for pastoral ministry, and he had married a young woman. She was about 18 or 19 when I first met her, and I was in my late 20s, and he was in his early 20s. My wife and I had them over early on in their marriage, and looking back, sometimes you wish you could recall those days and do some things differently, because I would notice that my friend, the student, was very gifted theologically, and he had one of the finest, and still does, one of the finest theological libraries that somebody who's not a pastor, somebody who's not in vocational ministry has. And he would often engage in theological discussions with my wife and I. But when his wife tried to make a comment, it was very evident that he didn't regard anything she said of value. And she was quite striking in terms of her outward appearance, very beautiful. And it became evident to me that he had married her for her physical appearance. They're Christians, but he had not married her for the inner beauty or her mind, but it was her outward appearance. And he later, many years later, admitted this to me. He said, I married her because she was quite striking. The last time I saw her, which would be about 20 years, probably about 20 years ago, she looked like she was still when I first met her. She was 18 or 19. She was one of these people whose physical appearance didn't seem to change over the years. I haven't seen her for about 18 years. Because about 20 years ago, she started an affair with their next door neighbor. Well, actually, no, his best friend, one of his best friends. And she divorced him. She left him with 3 children. And he was absolutely shattered. And he admitted to me at the time that he had not esteemed his wife. And I just wish that I remember my wife and I were remarking about it, that he didn't seem to esteem her, but we were young, and I didn't feel I could rebuke him, and I should have. I should have said something personally to him. You don't treat your wife properly, and it led to ruination of his marriage. And now he sought to rebuild his life as a Christian, but there was just no way he could ever go into pastoral ministry. You find the exact opposite in Pearce. That's a long kind of disquisition to compare him to Pearce. Pearce, he says at one point, the more we have been married, the more, he said, I esteem you as the best of women. And it's very evident that he honored her and prized her as a person. You can see that. He talks about theology and all of his concerns in these letters. And so I think there's a much to learn about, from this Baptist marriage.
Well, at the beginning, whenever you started talking about when he wrote her letters, you alluded to some of the other responsibilities that he had other than his regular preaching ministry, and that was our next question for you. But perhaps you can take some more time now to further expand upon what other evangelistic responsibilities Pearce had during his life other than the regular preaching of the word to God's people.
Yeah, so he would have been involved in pastoral ministry at Cannon Street. He was the senior pastor there for, the 10 years from 1789 to 1799. He did have some pastoral help at the end of that ministry as the church had become significantly larger than what he had come to. But he was also involved in church planting. This is a period of revival for the Baptists, and they are not only sending people on missions like Carey to India and the West Indies and the west coast of the West Africa, but they're also involved in village preaching, as they called it. going out into small villages where there was no gospel witness. There would be an Anglican church usually, but usually it was moralism if it was anything. Sometimes these churches were parts of 2 or 3 point charges, and they had no regular minister. And so Baptists would take advantage of this and go out and begin to preach in the villages. They'd seek to find somebody who was open to the gospel, ask him if he would open their home, and then use their home as a base of ministry and operation. And Pearce was involved in this on a regular basis during the week. He was also prevailed upon when the Baptist Missionary Society was formed in 1792. He became one of the executive committee. And the main work of fundraising fell upon him and Andrew Fuller. And in those days, what did that mean? Well, it meant, traveling by stagecoach to various parts of England. And this is before macadamization of roads. And so, especially in the springtime, travel by road could be very, very bumpy, difficult. Roads would get flooded out, huge ruts in the roads left by the winter, etc. And so travel was slow. And so he would be away. He'd sometimes, and I'm sure he must have made arrangements to fill his pulpit, but he would be away for maybe, a couple of weeks, traveling. He and Fuller called it begging. And Fuller reckoned that if he got £1 every mile he traveled, he was doing well. And I'm not sure. I'd have to think about how much the numerical value of £1 would be for us today. Maybe it's about $500, something like that. But it was arduous labor, and but these men did not. They didn't come from the churches that sent Carey to India and other missionaries out during this period. Were not wealthy churches. They're rural churches, many of them, or they're churches in industrial centers. One of the largest churches, which was a church of probably upwards of 1,000 members, they had difficulty meeting their pastor's salary. Benjamin Francis, he was there for 35, 40 years. And even at the end of his ministry, they could hardly meet his salary. These people were very poor, these Baptists in this period of time. And so that demanded that they had to do a fair amount of travel to raise money. And when he would travel, he would preach. So he would go to a church midweek, he'd preach, and then he'd go to the door and people would give him money for the Missionary Society. And we were so used to missionary societies today. The formation of the Baptist Missionary Society was the very first missionary society formed for cross-cultural mission. Now, in its wake, there were things like the London Missionary Society, the Methodist Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society. These are other missionary societies, all formed in the 1790s. But the Baptist Missionary Society was quite unique. And so this was all very demanding upon him. And they really needed somebody full-time to do this rather than a pastor. But that wouldn't come probably for about 30 years when they finally had a secretary. They did have a secretary. Andrew Fuller was the secretary, but a full-time secretary would eventually take the place of Pearce and Fuller in fundraising.
So throughout our conversation thus far, it's evident that Samuel Pearce was esteemed as a gifted preacher, and also he was a man who was concerned for the souls of those who heard him. And with that thought in mind, can you recount the story of Pearce preaching at 5 a.m. and how this sermon evidenced his concern for his hearers' souls and some applications we can draw from that?
Yeah, the incident is one that is rooted in an ongoing issue through the 18th century. Legally, the Baptists were free to establish churches. They had to register them with the state. But there were ongoing periods of violence, mob violence against Baptists. So one of Fuller and Pearce's friends, James Hinton, was nearly beaten to death in a place called Woodstock. Not the Woodstock of New York, but Woodstock just outside of Oxford. And around the very same period of time, in the early 1790s, Christmas time, a mob burned down a Baptist church in Guilsborough. There were a number of them arsonists, set fire to the church, burned it to the ground. The Baptists went to court to get damages, get payment for these damages, and they did so. They were able to, amazingly, the court found in favor of them, and they were able to get the monies to rebuild. And so they rebuilt. And in 1794, in the summer, it was in the May of 1794, they invited Samuel Pearce and Andrew Fuller to come and preach on the opening of the church. And Pearce preached in the morning, Fuller in the evening. One of the men who was there, a young man, he was 18 at the time, 18 or 19, was Francis Augustus Cox, who would later become a kind of really prominent figure in certain circles of Baptist life in Britain. And it's owing to him that we have the story. At lunch on the Sunday, people would stay for lunch, and a number of them said to Pearce that it was such a good sermon. Would he be willing to stay the night and preach the following morning? And Pearce probably realized that Guilsborough. I haven't done the calculations, but it probably would have taken him the best part of a day to get home. And so he thought, he would have stayed for the evening service, so he was probably going to end up staying for the Monday anyway. So he said yes, but he insisted it's got to be at 5 a.m. And he wanted to be able to preach to the working class, the working men who would be going out in the fields before they went out. And so they had a service at 5 a.m. 200 people showed up, and around 6:30, the service has been over and everybody's gone, and there are 3 or 4 ministers who are there: Pearce, Fuller, Augustus Cox, and 1 or 2 others. And Fuller said to Pearce, "It was a very good sermon, brother, as usual, but he said your structure of the sermon was really odd." He said, "It seemed to me you preached the sermon and then you did the whole thing all over again. Why did you do that?" And Pearce's response was simply, well, it was kind of a nonchalant, well, it's just the way it was. And Fuller is a very different personality from Pearce. Pearce was a very gentle person in one-to-one. In the pulpit, he could be like a lion, but one-on-one, he was very gentle, and that wasn't Fuller's way at all. He was a bit of a bulldog, and once he got his teeth into something, he was going to find out the reason. And he kept pressing Pearce, and finally Pearce said, "Well, sir, if you must know, I will tell you." He said, about 5 minutes before I was about to conclude the sermon, I saw the back door open and a man enter from the working class, and you could tell that by clothing. And he said, I could tell by the sweat on his brow and the fact that he'd gotten to the service at the very end, that it had taken him quite a while to get there, and he was obviously distressed that he hadn't been able to get there earlier and for the entire service. And he said, Pearce said, I reckoned that here was a man who either loved the gospel and regarded it as a feast, or he was a man who had never heard the gospel. In either case, he said, his effort demanded one on mine. And so despite criticism, because all the pastors will be sitting in the front row with the deacons of the church, and the kind of the deacons bench, and Pearce would know that these were men who knew how to structure sermons. And one of the most difficult groups of people to preach to are pastors, right? They know how to do this. This is their craft. And he thought, and he's still preaching, and he's thinking this, and he's thinking, whatever these men are good, I'm going to repeat the whole sermon and capsulize it in about 15 minutes. And he said, in the hopes of doing this man good, I gave him 15 minutes. And Fuller, who had been kind of jovial before this and kind of joking and pressing Pearce for the answer of why he had repeated the sermon, so to speak, Francis Augustus Sachs said it was not normal, but Fuller was quiet because we all realized that we had seen in action a love for souls. And Francis Augustus Cox recounted that story. I've not found it in print before, I think it's the 1830s. So it was nearly 40 years later. He still remembered this. It stood out in his mind about how we are to love men and women. And that was a mark of Pearce's preaching, which I think has to be emulated. There are times in preaching in which we have difficult things to say, and sometimes God's people need to be chastised by the word, but it has to always be undergirded by love. And I've been in theological education long enough now to know that congregations, if they know their pastor loves them, they will listen to him. But no matter how learned he might be, if they don't have that, they don't sense he loves them, they're not going to give him their full attention, or even their full obedience as they need to, as God's people being shepherded by their pastor. And love is critical. It's in fact, the more I've studied Fuller, and you see it in his memoir. He says of the more I've studied Fuller, the more I've seen him as a theologian of love. And in fact, at the end of his memoir, when he's summing up Pearce's character, he said the dominant theme of his character was holy love, a love for God and a love for sinners. He doesn't talk about the love for his wife, because his wife at the time was still living, but he could easily have included that.
Thank you for recounting that story. Perhaps briefly, you could recount another story as you answer this next question. What can we learn about Samuel Pearce's humble submission to the Baptist Missionaries Society's decision to not send Pearce to India? Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us what we can learn from his humble submission to this decision?
Yeah, Carey went to India in 1793. Within a year, Pearce and his wife Sarah are convinced that God is leading them to India as well. And so Pearce makes an application to go to India, and which would have meant leaving his church. I'm not sure he told his church at the time, but he did tell Fuller and John Ryland Jr., who were other members of the executive council, so to speak. And so they determined that they would meet with Pearce in 1794, November of 1794, at a church, a Baptist church at a place called Roade, Roade, in Northamptonshire. And the month before, Pearce devoted to prayer and fasting on a regular basis during the week. These Baptists, prayer and fasting as an accompaniment of prayer was not infrequent in their lives. You find a number of occasions when they would devote a day to prayer and fasting. But Pearce devoted a couple of days a week to prayer and fasting with his wife, seeking direction, reading scripture, and he kept a diary, which was available to Fuller when he wrote his memoirs. And by the end of the month, they were thoroughly convinced that God was sending them to India. And he wrote to Carey, he said, "We'll be there. We'll see you in a few months." And because it would take 6 months to sail to India from England, because there's no Suez Canal. So you have to go down the Atlantic, around Africa, and then into the Indian Ocean. And at the meeting, there was Ryland and Fuller and 2 or 3 other of Pearce's close friends, a man named John Sutcliffe of Olney, where John Newton had been the minister of the Anglican Church, and Sutcliffe was the Baptist minister. And they spent 2 or 3 hours talking to Pearce, asking him why he felt led and who was going to fill his place if he went, because he occupied a very important position in terms of fundraising and supporting and promoting the mission. And then they asked him to withdraw, and they spent 3 hours in prayer and discussion. And Pearce wrote later, he said, I felt all anxiety leave me and a commitment to the will of God, whatever it might be. At the end of the 3 hours, so they had spent 6 hours together, 3 hours or 2 or 3 hours with Pearce, and then 2 or 3 hours wrestling with whether or not we should recommend that Pearce go to India, which would mean they'd have to tell the church, and the church would have to find another minister, and funds would have to be raised, and so on. But at the end, they wrote a little note and put it in Pearce's hands that they were impressed deeply by the love that Pearce showed for the lost and the purity of that love, and they were quite certain of the giftedness of their brother, but they felt that the importance of the position that he held in Birmingham and the church held in the promotion of the mission, that they felt that it was in the mission's best interest that Pearce stay in Birmingham and not go to India. Pearce would later write to his wife that his deepest desires had been dashed, but I ever desire to make my Savior's will my own. One of the first times I ever related that story, I remember it was a man, it was a principal of a theological college or school. I remember him raising a question after it was a lecture on Pearce, and I gave that story near the end, and he said to me, how do you know? How did Pearce know the men who encouraged him to stay, and he did stay, were right? If Pearce knew what God wanted him to do, and his wife knew what God wanted him to do, why didn't he just go? And I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not always the quickest on my feet, and I didn't know what to say at the time. And it was about a year later, I was reading an article by the missiologist Ralph Winter, and I think he was talking about the importance of playing on a team, so to speak, in missions. And it suddenly occurred to me that question says more about the person asking the question than it does about Pearce. In fact, I realized that the question isn't a helpful question because the question's coming from the vantage point of, in that case, it was late 20th century, but not much has changed in the last 25 years, late 20th century North American individualism. If I know the will of God for my life, what do I need to ask anybody else to chime in? And God forbid that I should listen to anybody else who tells me differently. And I realized the question was wrong. And in fact, I can, if we had time and if this was the occasion, I could show you texts where Pearce himself says, I realized I was the member of a team and I had a role to play in England. And the success of the mission was not simply on me going, but on all of us pulling together, as it were. And I think there's something very important in that. One of the dangers of Baptist life, and in the late 18th century, Baptists were able to overcome it. It had afflicted them in the earlier part of the century, and it would afflict them in the 20th century big time, is individualism. Our polity leans in that direction, the autonomy of the local church. And if the autonomy of the local church is, a mainstay of our lives, then the autonomy of the pastor, the autonomy of church leaders. And we have a difficult time. Baptists, I think, have had a difficult time working together. And I think that has made some Baptists, wish that we had bishops. If we had bishops, we could have the bishop tell everybody what to do. But I don't think that's not the answer. But we have wrestled with the autonomy of the local church has developed as a key plank of our polity, along with the individualism of our culture. And so sometimes the emphasis on autonomy or the emphasis on individualism, I'm not so sure it's as much biblical as it is cultural in our circles. But at the end of the 18th century, men like Pearce were able to overcome the negative effects, I think, of kind of excessive autonomy and excessive individualism. And I think he's an example for us in this regard.
Amen. I agree. I remember when you first recounted that story in the class that I took with you on Andrew Fuller, and I thought the question was odd that was asked to you originally. But then again, as I reflected on what Samuel Pearce did, it was very commendable to me as a young man to see another man go through that. And even I remember when I was being ordained, I was asked what I would do if the ordination council denied it, like they denied my ordination.
Yes.
And I replied, well, I guess I wouldn't be ordained. So I guess I would just stop doing what I'm doing. And one guy said, wrong answer. It's like, you should keep doing what you're doing anyways. And I'm like, I don't really agree with that, but I hadn't read Pearce yet. So I'm gliding on the shoulders of someone far wiser than I even at that time. But that just seemed off-putting to me. I was like, is this all a charade? Me coming here if I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing.
Yes, exactly.
But with that being said, we've received much instruction from Samuel Pearce's life and ministry. Do you have any final encouragements that you would like to give us and our audience concerning the short-lived life of Samuel Pearce?
Yes, I think the kind of the main characteristic that Andrew Fuller found in his life, the holiness, the holy love that kind of undergirded his life, was so critical. And I think that's an ongoing kind of message to us. Sorry, there was a glitch there. I think the holy love of Pearce's life is something that we needs to undergird our ministries. And especially in our day, ours is a day that was in many ways similar to their day. Massive changes taking place in society, the Industrial Revolution. The American Revolution was just a couple of decades past. I mean, Pearce's earliest memories as a boy would have been the American Revolution. He was 10 when the revolution broke out. And he was in his late teens when it ended. And then the French Revolution, and that plunged England into war. His entire ministry was one in which England was at war. And the turmoil that those things cause in a society. He lived in tumultuous days. And yet days in which it would be very easy to allow anger and bitterness and hatred, particularly hatred for the French, which was kind of a defining characteristic of being English. I mean, to be English was to hate the French, and I'm sure the vice versa. But Pearce is not consumed by any of that. What he is consumed by is the kingdom of God and its expansion and the glory of God. And for that, the weapons of our warfare were prayer and humility and love. And I think Pearce stands. I think for me, Pearce is one of the key figures who rescued me from thinking that Baptists didn't have a rich spirituality and didn't have a rich heritage. Much of the immediate past of Baptist life is either the kind of glitzy stuff we've seen, which focuses on numbers and the outward show and is not doctrinally grounded, or a bit more distant past. I'm thinking here of the 1920s through the 1940s, the kind of fighting fundamentalists and the angry, bitter men who we needed in some ways, who kept the faith and handed it down to us, but they're not the best of models. And men like Pearce are just tremendous. The spirituality is so rich. It stands up to it compares to the best of any other tradition of Christianity. And that has been very important for me because a lot of younger men today younger men and women are deeply frustrated with, Baptist life. And I think it's not the only solution, but one of the solutions is we have to show them we have a rich history. And because of men like Pearce, I am not ashamed to be called a Baptist, not ashamed to own that name. And because there were men like Pearce who went before me, and they are godly examples of New Testament piety.
That is certainly an encouragement and a good word to end on. We have been speaking with Dr. Michael Haykin on Samuel Pearce. He has given us a biographical sketch. He has talked a little bit about some of the friendships that Samuel Pearce had, including perhaps his greatest friendship with his wife, Sarah. He talked about some of the evangelistic responsibilities of Samuel Pearce and the Baptist Missionary Society and his labors as a pastor. And he has given us applications that we can draw from Samuel Pearce's life. Dr. Haykin, thank you so much for taking the time to record with us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a delight. Thank you.
And to our listeners, we want to wish you grace and peace.
For additional content, check out our blog ministry at covenantconfessions.com. Also, keep up with our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Lastly, thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. Grace and peace to you.